very interesting because in the book of Zechariah, Zechariah tells how that someday the Mount of Olives, when Jesus comes, is going to be split in two. Half of the mountain moving to the north, half of the mountain moving to the south. And out of the temple will come this river that will flow all the way down to the Dead Sea and make it fresh. That's all in the Scripture. Well, you know, I went home and I was a subscriber at the time to the National Geographic magazine. And they, as you know, put maps in their magazines each time. When I opened this particular map, it was the earthquake fault lines of the world. And sure enough, National Geographic shows the earthquake fault line across the Mount of Olives over to the temple. And I said, see there, even National Geographic believes in the Bible. Whether they know it or not, I'm not sure. But when God is ready for the temple to be rebuilt, at least the Muslims have hollowed the ground out underneath to make it a little easier for the Lord. Don't know if He needs the help, but it is on very, very shaky ground, and even a small earthquake that would come across that fault would take down all the buildings on the Temple Mount, and they all know that. The Muslims now claim 100% of the Temple Mount, all 35 acres on top. Only thing the Jews claim is the western wall on the one end. You are looking here at the inside of the Dome of the Rock. They call it the Rock because this is the rock where some say this is the rock upon which Abraham was ready to sacrifice his son. But the Bible says he erected an altar. And but the Muslims believe that Abraham brought his son up here to sacrifice him, only it wasn't Isaac, it was Ishmael. Scripture's got it wrong. They got it right. But it is a magnificent building. And some of these pillars were from centuries gone by, so they incorporated those things inside the Dome of the Rock. The Crusaders took over the Holy Land in the year 1099 because the Muslims had conquered the country and the Pope wanted the land and these holy sites back. He sent the Crusaders. They were victorious. They occupied Jerusalem. They occupied the Holy Land, and they held it for 100 years totally, and then part of it for another 100 years. So they were in the Holy Land for 200 years, starting in 1099. The Crusaders were defeated by another of the successors to Muhammad, Saladin, in the year 1187 at the Horns of Hittin, and the Crusaders were forced to flee from the Holy Land. The Horns of Hittin, I just want to show you, that's what these are here, the Horns of Hittin. This down here, this is the Sea of Galilee. So that's where the Crusaders were defeated, and it's right above the Sea of Galilee. The Ottoman Turks ruled over Palestine starting in the year 1517. That's the same year that Martin Luther nailed the 95 Theses to the door of the Wittenberg Church and the Reformation began. The Ottoman Turks ruled the Holy Land then, or Palestine, for 400 years. And then Great Britain was the last, and as I told you, they're the ones who allowed the Jews to come back and the nation of Israel to be established. Between 1948 and 1967, Jews were forbidden to enter the Temple Mount area or to pray at the Western Wall. Just absolutely forbidden to come there for any reason whatsoever. But on June the 7th, 1967, the Temple Mount, the Western Wall, and the entire old city of Jerusalem was captured by Israel. This is the famous Six-Day War. Israel defeated 100 million Arabs in 6 days. In 6 hours, they took out all their air force, Egypt and Jordan and so forth. And you can see the Israeli soldiers, right at the time they captured the Western Wall, and they're standing there praying, and these men had just captured the wall, and they're resting in front of the Western Wall leading up to the Temple Mount. In an effort to appease the Arabs and gain world approval, Israel's always concerned about what the world's saying about them, Moshe Dayan, the defense minister at that time, the great general, turned over control of the Temple Mount to the Muslims. He was very, very friendly with the Muslims. And so to make peace and to show there was no hard feelings, he said, you go ahead and control. Now Israel is still the power under which they have to operate, but the day-to-day operations of the Temple Mount are controlled today by the Muslims, thanks to Moshe Dayan. Now as we talk about the temple, and I'm going to have to move on here a little more quickly than I have, but I want you to see, this is Mount Moriah. What you see here in this wall, the golden color, this is the mountain as it was at the time of Solomon. And Solomon had his temple up here, his palace up here, as well as the temple. But it was a roundy mountain. Just a normal mountain. It would be very difficult to walk on top of it except for the area where he had built the sanctuary. Then you have a period called the Maccabees. This is sort of between the Old and the New Testaments. And these were Jews who captured for about 100 years, they captured the Holy Land back. They enlarged the Temple Mount, and you see that in this red wall here. And then when Herod came along and rebuilt his temple, and as I said, he flattened and enlarged the temple area, and so he built this large retaining wall, and this is from the time of King Herod. I think that's helpful to get a sense of how things have changed over the centuries. Now there are 3 primary locations that have been put forward for the location of where the sanctuary stood. Why don't they know today where the sanctuary stood? Because it was destroyed so completely, with not one stone being left on another, there was no trace of where the temple stood. So today the archaeologists, the engineers, and the scholars are all trying to figure out where on the 35 acres of the Temple Mount did the original temple stand, because that's where they want to build the next temple, and they can't build it anywhere else, according to them. The one theory is that the temple stood at the site, the sanctuary stood at the site, the Holy of Holies, where the Dome of the Rock now stands. The second theory as to where the temple stood has it here in this area. You see again the Western Wall, the Wailing Wall. And so directly here into these trees, many scholars, or some scholars, believe that the temple stood here. And there are those who say that's where the temple should be rebuilt. But there are scholars that have arisen, and they're convinced, and I'm among, not so much as a scholar, but as one who follows this, the third theory. And they are theories. But I think this one holds the most water in many ways. Because again, you remember the Eastern Gate, the closed gate, that's still sealed shut here today. Because as I told you, you if you went through this gate and you walked in a straight line, all the gates were in perfect alignment. And if you were to go in there today and walk in a straight line, you would come to this little tiny dome-shaped structure that the Arabs call the Dome of the Tablets. Because according to early Muslim writing, this building marks the site where the Holy of Holies stood, and this marks the site where Abraham offered Isaac and so forth. But the fact that the gate would be in line with that simply means that the temple could be rebuilt without destroying the Dome of the Rock or the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And the fact that there is great likelihood that the temple will be erected during the time of the tribulation under the authority of the Antichrist. It well may be that in order to appease the world with the one-world religion and the politically correct society, that they could allow the Jews up here to have their site on the Temple Mount, the Muslims, and who knows, they might even find a spot where the Christians could be. But it will be very interesting to see. But another reason that I think that spot has great interest in, again, talking about the Antichrist, the Bible tells us in Revelation 11, 1 and 2, God is speaking to the Apostle John. This is on the Isle of Patmos as he's laying out all that is to take place prior to the coming of the Lord. He said, "Then there was given to me a measuring rod like a staff, and someone said, 'Go up and measure the temple of God and the altar, and those who worship in it.'" Because you see, anytime God gave a command to measure something, it meant it was His. He laid claim to it. Says, so you go up there now and you measure the temple of God, the altar, and those who worship in it, but leave out the outer court. Leave out the court which is outside the temple. Do not measure it, for it has been given over to the nations, and they will tread underfoot the holy city for 42 months. That's for the 3.5 years. I don't think it could be much more clear than that. That the Antichrist is involved in rebuilding the temple, that there's some type of structure up there for the Jews in terms of a rebuilt temple or a structure, modifying it in some form perhaps, but they are still allowed to have the Gentiles trampling over the rest of the Temple Mount for 3.5 years. I'm not being dogmatic. You don't need to believe this in order to go to heaven. Aren't you glad? But I think it's interesting to see what's going on over there. Do you realize, again, God sent the Jews off that land in the year 70 AD. He preserved the land of Israel all through those 2,000 years, so that when God said, "Come home," there was a home to come to. And interestingly enough, He even preserved the Temple Mount. And you know today the focus of the world is what? It's on Israel. It's the whole focus of the world. If only there would be peace between Israel and the Palestinians, there would be perfect peace on earth. And that's what the politicians tell us. And of course, we see how things are going from bad to worse in so many ways. Now this is the exciting part, the Temple Institute. The Jews today are preparing to rebuild the temple, and they're not waiting around to get the job done. Here you have Rabbi Yisrael Ariel, founder and head of the Temple Institute in Jerusalem. He was one of the paratroopers which liberated the Temple Mount in the Six-Day War. One of the first soldiers to reach the Temple Mount, and he wanted right away for the Jews to claim the Temple Mount, but you know, Moshe Dayan's decision, and the rest is history. But the organization that he heads is now preparing